So welcome back to Code with Shashank, and let's continue our to-do app. Now in previous video, we added a text input and a button. If you haven't watched that, I'll leave a link in the cards and in the description below. You go watch that and come to this one. In the last video, we added this header and this to-do input component where we can enter some text, and we also learned to add a custom font. Let's go further to app.js, and let's also add some functionality that when we click this add button, we can display the text we entered over here below. For that, I will create a component under my components folder. Call it to do list container.js and create a functional component. I don't need all this. What I need is a scroll view. Now there are two components from which you can implement a scroll view. One is a scroll view itself, and another one is flat list. Now the difference between these two is scroll view is best for finite number of elements and flat list is best for infinite number of elements, which means if you don't know how many elements will be going inside this scroll view, and the reason is scroll view loads all the elements inside that at once, and flat list loads the elements as we scroll through our scroll view. So here we can add infinite number of to-dos, so I'll be using flat list. Now if you have some limit, you can use scroll view. It is almost the same. So I'll use a flat list, which is a self-closing tag, and this takes an attribute called data, which should be an array of objects with one compulsory property called key or id. Now I want to manage all the to-do I entered over here in app.js, so I will use a state. Now those who don't know React, a state is like a normal variable where you can store some data, and you can use that here in your JSX, and whenever that variable or the state changes, all the components which uses that data also refreshes instantly. Now I will show that in action. Import use state. This is the function offered by React and not React Native, remember, which lets you initialize some state. That use state function returns an array with exactly two elements. Just say use state, and it takes a argument which can be of type anything. Now as I told, this will store our to-dos and this will be an array. Now I also told that use state returns an array with exactly two elements, so I can rename those elements to-dos and set to-dos. Now the first element in this array is the initial state we used, and we can use this variable anywhere inside our JSX. And the second element is a function from which we can update our state. We should never update it directly like this, to-dos is equals to some value. We should never do that. Instead, we should always update our state with set to-dos function, and the here are updated state. Let's use that to-do list container inside our app.js and pass our data. I will import that. And use that over here, and is a self-closing tag, and this takes an attribute that is our to-dos to list all the items over here, and attribute with the data we pass over here, we get that as a parameter in this function as props. The naming convention is props, and this variable is an object which contains all the attribute we pass over here, and we will simply say props dot data, and we have to pass that data like this. And remember, if you pass the attribute called data over here, and you should name this property also as data. And now if you are getting confused by so many datas over here, I'll just rename this to, let's say, to-dos, and I'll change that over here also, to-dos, and pass our to-dos, that is our state, that is an empty string initially. Now we are not done with our flat list. this takes another attribute called render item, and that is a function which takes one parameter, that is the item data. This flat list iterates through all our array and passes its data as a parameter to this function, and we return a JSX like we do over here. We can omit the return keyword because I'm using a parenthesis over here and not curly braces. Now for now, let's just display this with text component. Make sure you import that. And to insert a dynamic value, we need to add curly braces and the variable name, that is item data, and inside that there is an property called item, which is actually the item in our array, and we will simply say value because we will add that to our array. Now as I told, this to do should be an array and there should be one compulsory property called id or key that should always be unique to each element. Now we need to add our to-dos to this array whenever we press this button. For that we go to the to-do input and add onPress attribute to our button. Now obviously onPress is called whenever we press this button. I'll define a new function called add btn handler, and whenever we click this button, I'll pass data what we entered in this text input to app.js. For that, first of all, I need to store the data from our text input, and to store our data I will use state. I'll import the useState function and use it here and name our state as inpval, means input value, and the initial state will be an empty string. This is our state, this is the function from which we can update our state. I will add another attribute to our text input. The attribute is called value, and we will point this value to our state, that is input val, which is empty string by default. Now there is an error because we haven't specified anything on onPress. Let's point it to add button handler, and the error is gone. We are not updating our state anywhere, so whenever I input anything, it will be always going to be empty string because that is what we specified over here. So I need to update our state on every input we add over here. For that, we can add another event listener on our text input called onChangeText, and this should be a function. I'll say update inp. I'll define that over here, and this takes a parameter, that is the text we have entered over here, and let's simply set input val to the text. So now if we add something, our state changes and instantly the value also changes over here. Now let's add some logic to add button handler. Now to let our app.js know, I need to define the handler to this button click on app.js, and I will define that over here. Const add to do handler, and this takes a parameter that is entered to do. Let's name it entered to do, and we need to update our to dos, and we do that by set to dos. And there is two ways you can update your state. That is, one thing is by directly giving some value, and the second one is passing a function which takes one parameter, that is our old to do, or that is our old state, and whatever we return over here will be our updated state. I'll return an array which by default copies our old array, and this is how we copy an array. This is called array destructuring, by adding 3 dots before this. And we will add a new item that should be an object which should have a compulsory property called id, which should always be unique. And if I want to add a unique data always, I'll simply say date dot now. This simply returns number of milliseconds since January 1, 1970, and this should always be string, I'll convert it into to string. And the second property can be anything you want. I'll simply say value because over here in to-do list container, I'm outputting a property called value. So I will add a property over here value, and that will be entered to do. Now let's pass this function to our input to do. We can pass that via attributes, say add button click. That should be a function that is add to do handler, and we get that attribute via props, and I'll simply execute that function props dot add button click and our input val. That is the value we input over here. And if I click add, you can see the text we entered over here displays below our text input, that is in our flat list. We can go on adding this as many times as we want. You can add some validation over here also before submitting. I'll add one small validation that if our input val is not equals to an empty string, only then I want to execute this function, which means I want to add this to our to do only if it has some content inside it. If there is no content, means if it is an empty string, I should not be able to add. So this is a one small validation. So now let's go further and style our to-do list. I'll go to to-do list container. What I need to style is this text component. We will change that with a custom component. Before that, I'll add some margin over here and margin to our input to do. Let's add margin to the container, that is margin. And you can see there are different properties like margin, first of all, which adds margin to all sides, or you can select specific side like margin bottom and top, start, right, left. And there are two new properties which is not available in CSS called margin horizontal. As the name says, this adds margin horizontally, that is to left and right. And another one is margin vertical, which adds margin vertically, that is to top and bottom. I'll use margin vertical. I want to add margin to top and bottom, and the margin is of 20. You can see some spacing on both the sides. Let's add a custom component instead of this text component. I'll create that inside components folder, call it to do list.js, and create a React Native functional component. And since I will add a dynamic value every time, I need to get some props, and inside the text I need to display the to do. I will simply say value, which means I expect a value attribute whenever I use this component. Let's actually see how this looks like. First of all, import that component, import to do lists. Did I give it lists? Let's rename this to input to do list.js. Just to rename this also import exports. It doesn't really matter, but let's just keep it clear and import that to do list. I will use that over here. Now I told I expect a props called value, and I need to pass that over here, and that will be item data dot item dot value. That is this value over here. You can see this is almost the same as before because we didn't add any styles. Let's add a style, call it styles dot container, and let's give it a width of 80% and give it a padding of 10 and give it a background color of blue color, hashtag 269fe6, and after padding I'll give a margin vertical, that is on top and bottom of 5. Let's see how this looks like. Looks pretty cool. Let's add some more, and you can see we can scroll through our to-dos. Now you can see this goes beyond the navigation bar. We will fix that later. Now I also don't want this sharp corners, so I'll give it a border radius of 4, and let's fix this where our flat list goes beyond our navigation bar. So I will add a style to this flat list, that is style is equals to, let's say styles dot lists, and define that over here, and get a margin bottom of, let's say, 240. Let's see if this works. Yes, little bit, but there is a little bit more overflow, so I'll give it a margin bottom of 260, and you can see this looks pretty okay for me for now. We can see all our to-dos, and I also need to add a button next to it, and inside that button I want to add an image, a tick mark image. Now you learned in to-do input that we cannot style our button and we can add only text inside this button. Now how do we add a image inside it? Now we cannot add image to our button, but we can use an alternative to button, that is touchable, and there are different types of touchables. You can play around with this. Now the one I will be using for this is called touchable opacity. We can add a on press listener like in button. Apart from that, we can also add styles to it. So I will use that over here, touchable opacity, and this is not a self-closing tag. And inside this I want to add a image, and we do that by obviously image component offered by React, and image is a self-closing tag. And the image which we will be using is these two images called checkmark and edit png, and I have saved it inside a icons folder. I'll copy this and paste it under assets. You can see over here inside asset there is another folder called icons with these two images. And now this image takes a attribute called source, which is obviously the source of our image. Now to import that from our assets folder to here, we need to use a function called require, which is offered by Node.js and not React or something like that. And you cannot import that over here like this. It is not possible right now in React Native. So we need to require like this, and this takes a argument which is the path of our image, that is under assets, under icons, and the name, that is checkmark dot png. And you can see this image is very large, so let's add some styles to it, and the style will be styles.img. Define that over here, give it a width of 24 and a height of 24. The width and the height is okay. Now we don't want this tick mark to appear inside this container, but to sit beside it. So what we will do is wrap it with another view. We'll move that inside it, and instead of calling this container, I'll say to do container with small d, and rename that over here also. And I'll add this touchable opacity outside of this to do container. And now we can align this button next to it by adding styles to this parent view. Let's give it a name of styles.container, because remember we have changed this style to do container. I'll define that over here. Let's give it a flex direction of row so that it aligns vertically, and justify content of space between. And you can see this looks pretty okay. We will add a background to the touchable opacity soon. Now let's add also some padding to the right, so that this doesn't look behind the scroll view. So let's add padding right of 5, and this looks okay. Let's add some style to touchable opacity. And what touchable opacity does is, when you click on this, you can see the contents inside it becomes transparent, and that is because of touchable opacity. And you can control that opacity by adding an attribute called active opacity, and this takes a number that should be between 1 and 0. 1 means no opacity and 0 means complete opacity, that means invisible. And you can see when you click it becomes a little bit transparent. So let's add some styling also. Styles dot done button, and I'll define that over here and give it a background color of this green color. I need to change this margin vertical to container and not to do container, and add align items to center. And let's give it a padding to the button to touchable opacity, padding vertical of 8 and padding horizontal of 14. Looks pretty cool. Let's also remove that sharp border with the border radius of 4. This looks pretty nice. And that's all for today's video. You added some more styles, some more components in React Native, and learned to add image to your app. And in next video, we will add a on press listener to this button and also remove this from our list. So stay tuned. Give a like to this video if you liked it,